in a little more detail the exposure triangle. And again, the exposure triangle is the three ways in which we allow light to enter into our camera and thus strike the digital sensor, what used to be film, making a picture. So the first is the lens opening, which is called the aperture opening. And it can be different sizes. Very small would be f32, getting larger all the way to f1 would be much, much, much larger of a lens opening. Exposure, oh, and also if we have a small lens opening, we're going to get a deep depth of field. So everything in the background of the subject is going to be in great focus. Everything in the photo should be mainly in great focus. If you have a larger lens opening, you again have a smaller number here. And again, f or f-stops are another way of referring to aperture or lens openings. When you have a larger f-stop or aperture or lens opening, you have a shallower depth of field. And again, this is where the background is going to be blurry. So your subject would be in focus and the background would be blurry. So lens opening or aperture controls depth of field. And that has to do with how much is in focus. Deep depth of field, again, is everything is in focus. Shallow depth of field is some or all of the background is blurred, depending, of course, on how large you get your aperture opening. Again, f1 is quite large. So yes, aperture or lens opening controls depth of field, but it also is one of the three ways that light is allowed into the camera. Another of these ways is the shutter speed. And again, the shutter is that little door in the back of your camera that opens and closes for the set amount of time that you determine. The times are measured in fractions of a second. So you see them right here. This is really fast, 1/1000th of a second. Getting slower, 1/500th, 1/250th, all the way to half a second or a full second. You can have an exposure time of 30 seconds, 10 minutes, as long as you want, really. So shutter speed also is one of the three ways that we allow light into our camera. But creatively speaking, shutter speed controls how motion is portrayed. If you have a very fast shutter speed, like 1/1000th or 1/500th, you're going to freeze motion. That person jumping in the air on a skateboard or somebody doing a cartwheel, their motion is going to be frozen and captured, and they will be crisply in focus, even though they're in motion. If you have a slower shutter speed, 1/15th, 1/8th, 1/4, and so forth, you're going to have blurred motion, even ghosted if it's quite a slow shutter speed. And still a third control factor for how much light is let into the camera is your ISO. That stands for International Standard Organization, and it refers to how sensitive your film, or now the digital sensor, is to light. Low sensitivity or slow ISO is something like 100, and it gets higher and higher or more sensitive to light until you get to 3200. Sometimes you can even get a higher ISO in your camera. The compromise, as you see here, is when you get into the higher ISO settings, you're going to get more digital noise. That's when it looks like the image is really pixelated or grainy. So that's not a good thing. So obviously, if you can use a lower ISO setting given the lighting conditions, that's preferable. We will talk more about that. I want to take a minute to look now, and this should be allowing me to, I'm just going to delete this. Okay, this is the page that you have. Right here we have f-stops, which we know are aperture or lens opening. So let's just add that here. That's aperture opening. I'm going to hit the move tool here in Photoshop and move this over so you can read it. This refers to the size of the lens opening. So f16, you can see physically here, is a small lens opening. Remember, we're going to have small number equals big opening. So small number equals large opening. Okay? So when we have something like f16, that's actually a small opening. You can see right here, even though it's a large number. It's getting larger and larger and larger, letting in more and more light as you move all the way to f1.4. And you will notice physically this is quite a bit larger. as I just described, f-stops or aperture control depth of field, and that is how much in the background is blurred and how much is in focus. So this, and I'm just going to make my font size a little bit smaller, controls depth of field. And again, I'm going to move this out of the way so you can actually read it. So aperture controls depth of field. Here's something I want to tell you. When I go from, sorry, I have to go to the right layer. When I go from F16, I'm going to make my brush size a bit smaller. You're going to be learning a lot about this going forward. So when I make my jump from F16 to F11, I am letting in twice as much light. I'm going to make my brush size even smaller here. So I am letting in 2 times as much light when I go from F16 to F11. When I go from F11 to F8, I'm letting in yet another 2 times more light, or I am doubling my amount of light. I'm going to go to the text tool right here and just type doubling. If I could spell, light. So I am doubling the amount of light that I am letting in when I go from F16 to F11, from F11 to F8. Similarly, if I were to go from F4 to F2, I would be letting in half as much light. So let's go to this brush tool again. Let's go to the right layer again so we can do this. So when I go from here to here, I am letting in, sorry about this, half as much light. I am cutting my amount of light in half, or going down by 1 stop. When I am going from F16 to F11, I'm going up 1 stop. I am letting in 2 times as much light, or doubling my amount of light. Please forgive my spelling mistakes that I am just noticing here. Okay, shutter speeds. As we know before, shutter speeds control the way that motion is portrayed. So I'm just going to type that here so that we're all good. These freeze or blur motion, okay? And what I should do is move this over here, because right here we're going to freeze the motion. I'm actually going to take this, go back to my text tool. I'm going to take this and I'm going to delete this, because in fact, down here, these slow shutter speeds, these are the ones that are going to actually blur motion. So down here, this is going to blur motion, okay? You'll notice if you zoom in here that shutter speeds are measured in fractions of a second. Shutter speeds are measured in fractions of a second. So even though you don't see 1 over 1,000, 1 over 500, 1 over 250, it is 1/1000th, 1/500, 1/250th, all the way until you get to, this is 1/4 of a second, 1/2 of a second, 1 full second, and if we were to keep going, bulb just means however long you're holding down the button for, that's how long the shutter is open. We could have 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, and in fact, seconds are actually shown like this. You'll get these little quotation marks. So if when you're setting your camera up, you see these quotation marks, that's referring to these right here. That's referring to full seconds, okay? So shutter controls motion. It also controls the amount of light coming in. And much like aperture, if we go from one to another, we can either double or cut in half the amount of light that we are letting in. So if I go from 1 second to half a second, remembering that this is in fact half a second, I am cutting my light in half. I am cutting the amount of light in half. If I were to go from half a second to 1/4 of a second, I am cutting my amount of light in half again. But it works the same way. If I go, let's say, from 1/500th to 1/250th, I am doubling the amount of light that I'm letting in through my shutter. If I go from 1/250th to 1/125th, I am also doubling the amount of light that I let in. One final thing I want to say about shutter is you'll notice right here on your notes it says use a tripod to steady the camera. So if you are hand holding your camera, in other words, you don't have a tripod, you are going to want to make sure that you don't use a shutter speed anywhere in this range or slower. Otherwise, that handshake that we all have is going to show up and it's going to make your photo blurry. So use tripod. So you're going to use a tripod if you are using relatively slow shutter speeds. Anything slower than 1/30th of a second. So 1/15th, 1/8th, 1/4, you need a tripod. Okay, the third variable on our exposure triangle is ISO scale. ISO refers again to the sensitivity of the digital sensor at accepting available light. So the the degree of sensitivity of digital sensor to available light. So if it's a very sunny day, you don't have to worry so much. There's a lot of available light. You can use a slower ISO. It doesn't matter because it's going to take in that light very, very quickly. So ISO 50, 100, these are less sensitive to light. They will capture less light. More light is needed for good exposure. So a sunny day, this would be really good. You're going to get less image noise or grain the lower your ISO. But the darker your situation, an overcast day, inside with limited light, and inside, let's say you're at a play and you only have the light on the stage, or nighttime, you're going to need the higher ISO. It's going to be more sensitive to take in that light, and there's not so much light, so we need the sensor to be very fast at taking in what light there is. It will capture more light as such. Less light is needed for good exposure, but the compromise is that more image noise or grain is going to be part of your image, and that's not desirable. If you want to enlarge your image 8 by 10 or larger, it's going to look very, very grainy. Okay, so that's the basics of exposure. We'll be talking about this as we move through the course constantly. So please make sure you understand this and ask me any questions if you don't understand.